When my children first started school in the mid-90s, we did have kind of the end of a long era of local control that had come out of Ocean Hill-Brownsville in the late 60s, and it quickly turned to a centralized version of local control, the 96 reform. So we saw that the centralized system wanted to have the say-so in the appointment of superintendents. But we still had community school boards, and we still had local budgets. And the school boards, although they no longer had sole discretion in hiring the superintendents, it was a negotiated, I forget if it was the chancellor made the list and then the school board selected, or the school board made the list and the chancellor selected. It was a negotiated hire. So when my kids first started school, I walked into a very activist situation where it was really locally controlled. It quickly changed, but it was not a tumultuous change. We were able to maintain a fair amount of autonomy. And because progressive policies had been put in place by the more autonomous school board, those policies continued. There was no real big givebacks right away. And then in 2002 was the onset of mayoral control. And by 2003, those school boards were taken away and dismantled. Those district offices were taken away and dismantled. And those district superintendents were made superfluous and turned into a regional authority of several districts, ultimately a borough-wide authority that was all under this highly centralized system. So the first mayoral control laws that came out in 2002 were set to sunset after 7 years. If it was not renewed by the legislature in Albany, then it would revert back to the prior system. And so there were a lot of conversations about what that should look like. So in 2009, I was heavily involved in conversations over what do we want. We knew that the centralized system wasn't working. There was an awful lot of bad press, a lot of it fear-mongering based, a lot of it anecdote based about the bad old days. We can't go back to the bad old days with sort of the zeitgeist in the authority structure and the media. So a bunch of us worked as a kind of volunteer group, citywide, a diverse group of mostly parent leaders who came together. We created what we called the Parent Commission, and we held a series of information system sessions where we had experts, people like Jessica Schiller came and spoke to us about different aspects of the problem we were tackling, because we started out asking some informational questions. We brought in the experts. We had open public meetings, kind of town hall panelist style meetings, and then we broke into groups to sort of answer each of the structures that our questions raised. So what would be the solution to no checks and balances? What would be the solution to, well, what would happen on the local level? What kind of authority would be localized? Because what we wanted to do was create a hybrid system that was parent and teacher, maybe not necessarily controlled, certainly not centrally controlled, but one that was based in shared decision making, which is a model we do have in New York City and New York State through our school leadership team. So it's a good kind of language, it's a good kind of model where teachers and parents work in balance with the administration to make governance decisions on the school level. So we tried one called the, I think it was called the Shared Accountability Act. We had it passed in the legislature, but of course mayoral control was renewed with some tweaks. Community education councils work now.
Yeah.
So they were created in 2002 as a part of mayoral control that were the vestiges of the old local school boards. So in New York City there are 32, there originally were 32 original community education councils. They're actually called community district education councils, but the district piece has been dropped. But in the law, there's CDECs, now known as CECs. We've since added a number, which I can iterate later, but essentially they are the parent voice that is part of the governance structure in the city of New York under the mayoral control governance structure. So each CEC is made up of 11 members. 9 are elected and 2 are appointed. On the district level, those appointed members are appointed by the borough president of each borough, who also has an appointee on the centralized board, the central authority, which is in New York called the Panel for Education Policy. The 9 members are elected through a very Byzantine system where essentially the key officers of each PTA cast, it's a very strange thing, each of the 3 key officers of each school's PTA can cast up to 2 votes each for 2 different candidates. to come up with the 9 elected members who are supposed to be representative of a maximum number of schools in the district. So that you're not supposed to be able to elect several people from one school, but in a default where there's actually not enough people being elected, they will make exceptions. So it's a very Byzantine system of very indirect representation. The CECs have very few powers. They have a list of powers and duties. Most of them have been ignored. The one that seems to have been impossible to lift is that of zoning. In my district, we have no zones. We remove the catchments for a more equitable form of admissions. So we don't have that where you live determines where you go to school. We have a different system. So we don't have that power. So it's not a power we've ever been able to exercise. In a number of CECs, that power to basically veto rezones that the DOE has to propose, that has often been used to negotiate other things. For instance, instituting equitable admissions in one school in Brooklyn. So the other powers are largely advisory, and many of them are just ignored. There are some citywide councils. Originally, there was one for high schools because high schools are citywide admissions, and so they're not district or locality bound. And then we had one created for the students who have disabilities. So there's a citywide council on special education, and there's a citywide council for English language learners. And we also added another community education council on the district level for the special education separate school system, which is called District 75. So you're not in the general education population, you go to District 75 schools. So now there's an additional council that is district level, although District 75 is citywide. Well, when they removed the district offices and the elected school boards and started rolling not just authority, but the bureaucracy up into regions and then eventually boroughs, it became inaccessible. Information was inaccessible, bureaucrats were inaccessible, decision-making was inaccessible. And so this is a really effective way of just really stopping any kind of sense of community, any kind of commitment to coming up with solutions. Becomes every person fighting for themselves, for their child, against this faceless bureaucracy that you can't find. After centralizing for some time, the Bloomberg and Klein administration realized actually that top-down, one-size-fits-all doesn't work. We've been telling them that for a number of years quite loudly. But they themselves came to the same conclusion, and it was, the proof was in the pudding. Nothing was changing. Test scores weren't going up. The achievement gap wasn't changing. Things were just as bad as they'd been before. And so they came up with a hybrid system called networks. So they originally made it instructionally based, where schools, through some kind of bizarre speed dating and then eventually became institutionalized, they created these instruction-based networks where they would get their instructional support. And eventually, the folks in the bureaucracy figured out this was the best way to hide the cheese. So they even put the bureaucracies into these networks. So now you have schools that are geographically located, but their support and even their lifeblood, all of the back office stuff, is also networked. So in my district, which is tiny and only has 25 schools in total, we had 11 different networks operating. So nobody could find who was the support or the authority, and the district superintendent still had a job, but that job had been made irrelevant. She was actually a scribe who was supposed to do quality review reports to feed the system for pseudo accountability. Her job was, she was not able to do her job by going into the school. She'd have to get permission from the networks. The only reason they even kept the district superintendents was where there were a couple of consent decrees that came out of people saying, wait a minute, when you created mayoral control, you didn't mean to take apart the districts, and we still want them to be alive. So all of our fights on the legislature that have resulted in some of the tweaks have been met with sort of these half answers. So the district superintendents nominally kept their jobs, but they had no superintendency. They had no role in the districts. You know, I'm a parent, and so I'm no expert. I can only sort of say from far away. I know that teachers felt much more able to act on a local level. The union has always had an active role in city politics, particularly around education. And when things were on a local level, it was less union controlled because there were local reciprocities and relationships. There still was a union structure, And actually unions were quite involved in the school board elections. When my community ran a progressive slate to take over the local school board, people had left New York City. You know, there had been flight of all kinds from New York City. And when my neighborhood started to gentrify, essentially, people started moving back in. It was a lot of sort of hippies and artists in the East Village. And they looked around, they said, hey, there's great public good schools and nobody's using them. Much was true of the parks. I mean, they were being used by homeless encampments. But people started saying, how can we make the city work for all of us? And they figured out that it was a political machine and they needed to run a slate. So they ran a very multicultural, very diverse political slate, and were able to institute a bunch of progressive policies. They did so with backing from the union. So the union was involved at all different layers politically. Now it's very convenient for any kind of power broker, including a union, because if all the power is at the top in one place, then it's a much easier access point. So instead of fighting on 32 districts to make sure that we have some say in the local authority, we really only have one constituent, right, and that's the mayor. So the union has not supported most of our attempts to return to any form of local control. There have even been, when we did the Parent Commission, we met with folks from the union who had started their own kind of union-blessed, centrally blessed work group. And we met once and came up with our recommendations and compared them. And the recommendations were very, very similar. We were surprised at how many common points we'd both come up with. And those union very own recommendations were buried. And that's not what went up to Albany with Randy Weingarten and got negotiated. I think nothing's a silver bullet, nothing's a panacea. I think any system of governance requires a couple of elements. I think it needs broad bases for input, lots of access by different stakeholders, but I also think it needs some form of checks and balances. I think that there are some benefits to centralization. Certainly some of the old bugaboos against local control, even if they're exaggerated, they're true in the sense that inequity can be supported by a centralized system if there's no checks and balances, and it certainly is much more proliferate in a local system if there's no checks and balances. So there are still inequities today under centralization, that's for sure, but they're harder to hide when there is a centralized sort of standard. The downside, of course, to that standard is that not one solution is going to work for all communities. So solutions need to be community-based, but I think the allocation of resources, the checks and balances, the capacity for auditing, those should be centralized functions so that you really can look out for equity across the board. We certainly had tremendous inequities under local control. Not many of those inequities have changed under centralized control. But we have seen something that did happen, and it's hard to unwrap the move towards mayoral control and a lot of the neoliberal educational reforms. In New York, they kind of happen together. So it's really hard for me to say what's driving what. But we certainly saw a rise of the bottom under centralized, standardized control of the schools. We also saw sort of a dip on the top. And I think in some ways, over time, we've seen a general lowering of, I don't want to say standards because that gets confused with the sort of, Common Core educational form of standards, but we've seen sort of a drop in the quality of education. Maybe that's tied also to the recession and a drop in budgets. But I think there was some positive lift that people responded to where the bottom came up under centralization. And it's not continued, I would say. I would say that we've sort of had a drift almost towards a lower point. And it's been a unifying force in a funny kind of way because privileged people are not getting as much as they used to out of the system. And that is partly a function of centralization and standardization. And so it's created strange bedfellows in the sense that the Department of Education is an equal opportunity oppressor. And so it's brought together people who formerly would not have considered themselves allies. And I think there's some strength that comes from that. So kind of having one common enemy, one common fight, one common language, in some ways has created a force among the people. It is very hard to maintain that. It is very hard to actually do anything about it. We are still separated, even with this common enemy, by the things that separate us in the human condition and in a unequal, racist, capitalist economy. Those things still keep us apart. But it is a positive in the sense that we all relate to oppression now, whereas that was probably not the case under local control. Some people were highly oppressed and some people were kind of gaining something from the system. If you don't give people access to information and power, they can't control anything. They can't really respond to the problems in front of them. We need to have local solutions to respond to local problems, problems that we identify as problems. And so we would need to be able to have the kind of access to information, training, connections to each other for communication. What this system does is it pushes us all apart. Klein created not a great system of schools, but a system of great schools. That's very intentional, so that the center of all activity is the school with the principal at the head. And then our job as parents or teachers is to focus on our student or our students, our child or our students. And so we're very separated then. We're primed the way we are under No Child Left Behind or capitalist society. I have to get mine. I'm on the treadmill. And it doesn't matter what's happening to anyone else. We are separated that way. And then the authority system parallels that. Now we have a mayor who appoints a chancellor, and the chancellor oversees the superintendents who oversee the principals, and it's just more of that sort of climbing, comparing ourselves to each other to get to the top. And that's, anyone who's ever been in a classroom, in a family, knows that it's not competition that helps us grow and learn and become the kind of accountable citizens and people that, the human beings that we need to have running the world and the next generation. So the issue really is, how do we get to a place where we are a collectivity and we see our problems and each other's problems together. So we need to go back to a neighborhood level, to go back to a community level, and we need to be able to have access to the information that helps us analyze, well, where are the problems, what are the issues, and then we need to have access to the resources to solve them. So that means having policy levers, because anything that's going to happen in education is going to happen as a result of policy. The inequities that we have are structural and policy driven. The answers to those are also policy. And nobody has access to them except for, in New York City, it's the Panel for Education Policy. And they are largely appointed by the mayor. The majority is appointed by the mayor. The rest tend to generally follow the mayor because they're appointed by the borough presidents who work with the mayor and depend on the mayor. And so we don't have any input to decision making. But if you don't have the information to even know what the decisions are or need to be, because it's happening way out here and it's very removed from your reality, then even having access to decision making wouldn't make sense. So how do we bring really all of the governance to a local level? And then how do we build that back up so that there's some form of accountability, checks and balances, a lookout for fairness, and the big policy questions that are beyond what is a local problem. For a community school district, we look at things like admissions policies. What is a fair way to assign students to schools? We have some schools that are that have high concentrations of high-need students, and then we have other schools that serve very few students in temporary housing or English language learners or students with disabilities. So that's a community-based decision to decide, well, what makes sense for us? I was at another district this week talking to them about our example in our community, and they were saying, well, that wouldn't work because you're geographically set up this way, and I completely understand. I wasn't telling them to follow my solution. I was telling them how we derived our solution. It was easier for them to reject our solution because it didn't fit their geography. That wasn't really what they were talking about. On a school-based level, there's a million things that can happen. What do we want to do with our school budget? The part that is discretionary, even though it's smaller and smaller, it seems every minute. What are our values? What's important to us? What are the policies that matter to us? How do we want to engage with families? What kind of staff do we need to have to be able to do that? What kind of curriculum are we interested in? How culturally relevant is it to our demographics, to our population, to our neighborhood? What are the standards that we're preparing students for, and how do they make sense? And then how do we implement those? What kind of after-school care do we need? What kind of food do we need to have? What do we need to do to improve our facilities? These are the kind of local decisions that require information to analyze and then resources to respond to. And right now, no one has access to really any of those things. I know that, for instance, community education councils always weigh in on co-locations, school closings. They actually have a role, a statutory role, even though it's largely advisory and is often ignored. I myself have participated in difficult decisions about what makes sense. Co-locating a charter, if it's robbing Pedro to pay Paula, that's not a solution. But if we can find a way where all kids are going to get access to a better education, even if it means finding room for a charter, which I may not ideologically support, the reality is if that's going to be something that's going to give more children access, then we can find ways to resolve it. And I find communities, I find consensus building is incredibly easy. People really want to partake in information, exchange ideas, come to consensus-based values and come up with solutions that are win-wins. That is very much, I find, part of what makes community community. There is always a tendency among some people to really think in terms of themselves and what the cost will be to themselves. Even if the cost is not immediate, they themselves may be grandfathered into the current situation, but they worry about what is my school going to look like if we, for instance, integrate or if we expand our programs or something. But generally, those voices are the minority voice, and they can often be tempered by people calling to our better nature and saying, if it doesn't work for all of us, it doesn't work for all of us. So how can we rethink this to make it more fair? So certainly looking at a facilities budget system-wide and making those difficult decisions, but those are our difficult decisions. We buy into it, we accept it, we understand the consequences because we've worked through the numbers. This isn't someone telling us it has to be this way and live with it. We may be able to inform that process with local information that somebody out here couldn't possibly know from a spreadsheet. And so we actually may come up with a better solution, and there generally is a win-win in every difficult problem. And when there's something to give up, if I understand why I'm giving it up, then I'm not angry about it, I'm acceptant of it. And when I accept something, then I can work around it much more freely and actually make it a better situation. So that's been our experience trying to solve on a community level. I think it makes much more sense to have authority at the more local level. I think that people who are going to benefit and live with the consequences of a system should be the people who are making the decisions about it. And so I honestly believe that this is what representational government is. It's what we have in this country. It's what democracy is. So it's really how do our voices get formalized in a way where we can all make decisions together to decide what's best for us. The problems come when not all stakeholders are at the table or when power is not fairly distributed, and so all voices are not represented or don't carry the same weight. Those are the problems that are hard to solve and have to be solved for community-run anything to make sense. There has to be some form of check and balance. There has to be some sense of what is acceptable, what is moral, what is allowable in order to have these community-based decisions. But I think one of the pieces that you have to have is the structural piece, the governance. For us, our school leadership teams, which are part of these shared decision-making laws that were passed in 2004 in the state of New York, and they require a certain number of parents, an equal number of parents and staff and administrators to make local decisions around the goals and educational priorities of the school that should align, that the budget must reflect. and then should be revisited. How are we doing on the goals that we picked for our school, for ourselves? That's a really great structure. And then from any kind of governance structure where you're saying we need to have shared decision making, we need to have access to information, we need to have access to resources, and then we need to be able to link up through the system to a centralized, whatever that is, if it's an authority or if it's a bureaucracy, we really need to be able to reflect that all the way down. So to me, the answer is governance is where you start to walk the walk. Organizing is how you inform what that governance looks like, and then electoral politics is how you inform who gets to be at that table if it's a democratic representational structure. So to me, it's really about thinking about a structure that we can put in place that says shared decision making is important. I mean, if you read anything about management today, right, everything at Google is all about how everything is horizontal and shared and flat, and how the best decisions come when different stakeholders are at the table and they feel comfortable and it's safe and every voice is heard. So if we know that to be true in Silicon Valley, why don't we know that to be true in our schools and our public institutions? I think what you have to do is say, where are our deep values? And if you're an Olinskian organizer, then you say, well, you know, none of that matters. What matters is that we move forward together, and so there are no permanent partners and no permanent enemies. There's another way of looking at things. I'm much more of an ideologue, and so I would have a tendency to say, if I don't buy into your umbrella values, then it's going to be hard for me to partner with you, because very soon we're going to come to a place where we don't agree, whether it's in methodology or means or aims, you know. So I tend to try to find people who are more ideologically in line with me in terms of deep values. That being said, any movement I've ever been a part of, it's what we in the left call our circular firing squad. We tend to get very critical of the sort of nuanced values. So I work with a lot of people on integration, and I'm all about systemic change, and I have colleagues and allies who are trying to make very small changes, and we're at odds because I think that their small changes tend to get in the way and set back the larger movement because they relieve some pressure here and there, but they don't attack the structural problem. They think that I'm a hardcore curmudgeon who won't let little good things happen because I'm making the perfect the enemy of the good. So I think we all have to find our way in those battles. But I think when you know that, for instance, in the case of charters, you're talking about a parallel system that is privatization of public resources. You can't really be bedfellows in that sense, because you really are operating in different universes. And so the same thing's happening when I talk about equal opportunity oppression and privileged families working with low-income families of color. There's always going to be pushback to say, well, you're with us now. But those of us who are always on the short end of the stick, we know that when you get your problem solved, we're still going to be here at the short end of the stick. And so those tensions, I think, are always real. So, you're bedfellows while it works, but eventually those things come apart until you really get down to, well, what is keeping us apart and what do we really need to work on? And that's when it's all about who's got voice and how is power distributed in your own movement. So it's about being really self-conscious and self-critical all the time and checking in. I mean, I do things on the citywide level and I do things on the hyper-local level, but I find a community is a good arena because it's enough voices and it's the right scale of problems. What works, and I also know that I can have relationships and understand the problems and have access to solutions on my community level that on the citywide level are overwhelming. So all I feel we can do is model and take what we're doing and see what works for you or what doesn't work for you, or if there are parallels. But let us do our work and see if it can inspire you or move you, or you can reject it, but you have to do your work because it's all about your community, your relationships, and what's endemic to your problems. With District 1, it is a huge exception. We're very small. We were one of the original experimental districts under community control, under the, right after Ocean Hill-Brownsville. And so it kind of remained really small. And we remained small because our local assembly member for a long time, up until recently, was a very powerful man. He was one of the 3 men in the room. He was the assembly speaker. And so we got away with things that are literally not legal. So we're smaller than the legal size for a district. I think the legal size is 10,000. We're just under that. We have 31 schools if you count the high school. It's 25 if you count our pre-K to 8 configurations. But most districts are 20 to 30,000 students, and they have 40, 50 if you count high schools, is much more the norm. We're also tiny geographically. We're probably like 2 miles by 2 miles, if that. We're bordered by the river on 2 sides. We're bordered by a large district on the other side that's most of Manhattan. If you take out sort of the small communities of color in Manhattan, that's what you have is the other surrounding district. So we're really an anomaly, but every district is an anomaly in its own way. There are large districts in Queens, Staten Island, the entire borough is a district. I mean, every district is different, and that's why I believe working on a community level is a good lens for wrapping your mind around the problems and solutions. Racism is the scourge of this country. I think if you let problems go unaddressed long enough, you know, Abraham Lincoln said it, the people are a sleeping giant, and I think people rise up. I think we're seeing this around police brutality and violence, you know, this, you know, Black Lives Matters kind of movements where people are saying enough is enough. And so I think that eventually anger boils up and turns into action, and eventually that action becomes some kind of unified, replicable movement. And if a system were smart, it would be agile, and it would be able to encompass those kind of changes by responding to problems before they become literally, you know, riot-inducing. So to me, that's sort of one of the main takeaways. But nothing was solved through Ocean Hill-Brownsville because the system is agile, and so the system did create a response. And that response did not remove the inequities. It did not remove the structural problems of racism. So the takeaway is you keep trying. You keep trying till you get it right, and you learn from history, and you keep moving forward, and you build relationships, and you learn to listen to people, and you keep trying. Teachers and community have the same goals and priorities, which is the well-being of students in schools. The teachers' working conditions are the students' learning conditions, and so ideally they should really be married. I don't see how you do anything without community and teachers being aligned, because otherwise you're going to be pulling in opposite directions. So doing things to teachers at the expense of teachers is not going to be an effective way. There has to be a partnership, because really we're all part of that, the village, right? That is the support to those students, which is what this is really all about to begin with. So I think there's it's not just advantages, I think it's a necessity. I think the problem comes when we get into power structures that are removed from that local level relationship and affiliation and common goals. So when you have a large union, a union of 80,000 teachers plus add some up, it's 125,000 members, they pay dues, that's a big war chest, the interests become very different. So when you start to centralize that power of the teachers, and then the parents actually don't ever seem to have unions. We've tried to start them a lot of times, it's very difficult to do. So there's no counterweight. You have the situation we have now. So I think you do need to create that local level power. However, if you took the power, for instance, in New York, of the UFT away, who would stand up to, in the past, Bloomberg? Who would stand up to Bill de Blasio? The unions for many years under this, you know, hedge fund fueled education reform agenda have been really the last hold against some pretty horrendous initiatives. And there have been plenty of times where we've been able to align to fight against, standardized, excessive high-stakes standardized testing, evaluation of teachers by testing, teachers' conditions that would affect students' learning conditions. It's been very important for there to be a counterweight. It would be just a much better counterweight if that union were informed by its own teacher base, and if that teacher base were aligned with the families of the students that the teachers are teaching, then we could really shift towards values that made sense. So it's really about transforming the powers that we have to be able to encompass these more local voices and to have more stakeholders than just teachers. So in 1968 in New York City, there was a large political conflict where the union went on strike in response to a change in New York City that gave the local school districts the ability to hire and fire teachers in a predominantly African-American community called Ocean Hill, Brownsville. It's a neighborhood still today. It's still the similar demographics, starting to gentrify a little bit, but not much. That neighborhood, the local control, the largely black school board, decided to remove, I don't remember if they were teachers or superintendents or a combination, but some staff, they had to have been teachers, I guess, teachers who were white, who they felt were ineffective. And the union joined in the opposition to the local teachers to say, we don't want to have these be the rules and we're going to stand up to this. And so they went on strike in order to not have local control by the school boards involved in what they felt were union decisions. I don't know what the collective bargaining agreement was at the time and how that all worked, but it turned into a largely racially charged standoff in the city where, and it was of course in the middle of the civil rights movement across the United States, so it took on all of the colors of that larger national movement, and it became a seminal moment in New York City history, education history, and the response to it was creating the 32 school districts and having more autonomous local control. And the union and the Ford Foundation and a lot of the powers that be were able to negotiate what that would look like. And so some things were addressed, but the basics were not. And it ended in some ways in a good place in that we got some local control out of it. We got from 68 till 2002 a form of local control. But there were districts that used their local control to create, white enclaves of power, right? I mean, local control unchecked can be as misused as centralized control unchecked. To me, the secret really is in, do we have checks and balances? Are we all being accountable? And then when you go back and think about it, I had sort of alluded to this earlier, what you really need is and we came up with this in the Parent Commission, you need a form of a constitution. What good is governance? My friends used to kind of say governance, schmovernance. Who cares who's governing if we're not really attacking the problems that matter? So what is this about? What is this enterprise that is public education? What are we committing to? What are we saying we're going to do? And then the governance can be the way that we oversee that, but we have to first know what rights and responsibilities are we conferring on ourselves. And that really is what matters. If we're saying a 50% graduation rate is acceptable, then what does the governance matter? If we're saying that there can be a large discrepancy between what schools look like and who they serve and what resources they have access to, then what does the governance matter? Governance only makes sense if it's a way for us to get at solving these problems. But we really need to define our educational constitution first. That's a place to start. Maybe that's where you start. Maybe organize around that. What we decided in our proposal was that we would have something like a Human Rights Commission. We would launch a constitutional commission, an education constitutional commission, and we would ask the people to help us form that constitution as part of our governance reforms. So we didn't think we had all the answers. We thought we had a lot of questions, but we thought that the answers could be found collectively in the people, and that it was important to create a structure for being able to inform that and negotiate it and come to consensus. I assume when we're saying community, we mean youth, but you know, that's not a stakeholder group that gets any player consideration. I mean, I know a lot of people try, and I know that's not an intentional lack. Generally, it's that the same problem that I described that community has, kind of the same problems even the teacher has, kind of the problem we're all asking ourselves, well, where do you start? It's just that for youth, it's compounded. They don't have access to information. They're not empowered. They are the subjects of this system that we're talking about. So really, the problems and the questions and the answers do start there. But we have to sort of like the oxygen mask, you know, you have to do it for yourself before you do it for a child. Until we can kind of solve it for ourselves, it's going to be difficult to find a way to empower youth. But that has to be a piece that's built along the way. It can't be an afterthought either. But so it's really difficult to navigate all those pieces.